Well, joining me live now, Liberal MP Jason Falinski. He's not one to stay home on a public holiday. He's joining us live in the studio. Thanks so much.
Happy to fill in for Sarah Hanson-Young, so thank you for having me.
That's a cheap shot. And you're not getting paid penalty rates for this? Let's just be clear.
And nor are you.
No. But it's been a long time since I've had a public holiday off. But we can moan and complain about the lot of being a politician later
Your producer's
on.
telling you to get on with it.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm also thinking nobody out there is really feeling sorry for politicians, are they?
No, not these days. Polling shows they're not.
Well, Tony Abbott took a bit of a poll of his own on his poly pedal as he went across the state of New South Wales. He says that Middle Australia is frustrated with politicians saying one thing and doing another.
Yeah.
Do you find that when you move around your electorate?
Well, I mean, you're from the United States. Isn't that the thing that drove the Trump candidacy more than anything else?
Don't pin the Trump thing on.
No, I wasn't trying to... No.
Not my president, okay?
No, I understand. But I mean, you know, when he would say things that were internally inconsistent and didn't make sense, you know, his supporters would still say.
People do like it, perhaps. Or are you suggesting that when politicians say one thing and do another?
Well,
no,
just
accept that?
Well, I think people just want to know. They just want politicians to be straight with them, don't they?
Right.
And it's not just politicians; it's leaders across the board, isn't it?
Well, I think people would appreciate that from the politicians. But and I'm not here to get you to defend Tony Abbott or to provoke a defence of Tony Abbott, but it did strike me as a bit odd, because here's Tony Abbott who said, you know, there'd be no cuts to the ABC or the SBS, and then there were, and there'd be no cuts to health and education, and then there were. You know, my point is more that this is just sometimes a function of political existence. People say something and then they realize when they get there they can't hold true to some commitment that they made. You know, is Tony Abbott perhaps creating an unrealistic expectation for politicians? Well,
look, I'm very happy to defend Tony Abbott because he's a friend and I think he's doing a great job. And I think what he's saying is that to the best of our ability we should be clear that what we are saying we mean, and we will do what we say we're going to do. You know, Ronald Reagan was, of course, the president that was going to cap taxes and didn't believe in tax generally, but of course I think there were 245 taxes. But no one had any doubt about Ronald Reagan that he wanted to cut taxes. So, I mean, I think people need more than ever, they need to know what their leaders stand for and to be direct with them about it.
If I can put it this way, maybe since Reagan's time, people have become a bit more jaded or a bit more suspect of politicians giving them some slack. I mean, the reality is you're right. It was often said about Reagan, you know where he stands, except his actions were actually quite different to what he claimed he was going to do. And you look at a lot of politicians today, the one thing, over and over when governments make promises, that's when they suffer in polling and that's when they suffer at the ballot box.
Yeah.
And, Tony Abbott, I suspect has hit on a truism. Maybe he learned through bitter experience of his own that governments have to do what they say they're going to do.
Well, to the best of their ability. I mean, the classic example, I think, in Australian terms is when Kevin Rudd said climate change was the great moral, the great moral challenge of our lifetime or our generation, and then rolled over on it. I mean, you can't build these things up only to roll over on them. So with Reagan, I think the thing was that we all knew that he wanted to bring down taxes, but we all knew that from time to time people have to make compromises. We all make compromises in our personal lives, don't we?
Well, I don't know about you if this is true confession time here, but I do think politicians live in a world that utterly requires compromise. You've got a Senate crossbench, for example, with this government, where they've had to make compromises they would not have otherwise made in order to get certain measures passed.
Well, and that's the point that Tony makes about the Senate. The Senate has totally changed Australian politics in the last couple of decades, where it doesn't respect government's mandates, whether they be Labor or Liberal governments. And the result of that is that you now have this sort of very populist policy-making thing happening at the moment, and I don't think it works.
Is it fair to blame it all on the Senate crossbench?
Yes.
Okay, it is fair. I'm going to say because with very few exceptions, governments have always had to negotiate with the Senate. I mean, that's just the reality of how governments work at state and federal level.
Yeah, but even at a state level, the upper house in New South Wales still by and large, the crossbenchers recognise that governments have mandates and that they should be allowed to implement their program, in particular if they took it to the election. In the federal Senate or the Commonwealth Senate at the moment, there isn't that recognition. And that's not, it's always been that way. That's something that's quite new. The Democrats didn't believe that. I mean, take money bills, for example. The Senate always accepted that governments were allowed to put money bills through without getting amended. That doesn't exist anymore in the Commonwealth Senate.
All right, well, let's move on from trying to fix the Senate. I don't see, apparently according to George Brandis and others, we have to wait to the next election to see if the Senate reforms will make the change.
Yeah, that's true.
And what a great gift you guys have given to the Labor government, incoming Labor government, when that happened. Sorry, that was a cheap shot.
You're getting me back for a moment.
But I want to talk about housing affordability because it fascinates me that the federal government has waded into this space. This seems to me to be a classic whack the states on this one. You know, the problem, if the government wants to characterize it as lack of supply, it's the state's fault that there's not enough supply. So why is Scott Morrison wanting to make this the centrepiece of his government, of his budget?
Well, we have a budget process, and I don't know if you'll be able to contain your excitement for the next 4 weeks, but it will, in the next 4 weeks, we'll know what's in the budget. But look, I think it's because in Sydney and Melbourne in particular, this is a major problem for the young generation who are trying to get into the housing market, and governments can't stand by and just ignore that. Absolutely, part of the problem has been, well, the problem is undersupply of housing in the Australian housing market. That's due to zoning laws. I mean, you're a former planning minister. You know the difficulties of matching local community concerns with the overall need for more
density,
housing.
Yes, I think I think we were fighting all the time to get more than 10,000 new dwellings in the Ku-ring-gai electorate.
Well,
So, but I hear you and I understand, and it will always be the case that you can find ways to change the planning system, to reform it, to accelerate it, to get, you know, what I used to call clear, more certain, transparent decisions in the most efficient time possible. However, you know, it seems to me it's fair to say part of what's fueling demand, or the reason that demand is outstripping supply, is also because the investment rules just so favour property as an investment class. That people are looking for returns and they can get them from property, particularly capital gains returns, they simply can't get in other forms of investment.
So I understand that that's what some people think, and that's certainly an argument that a lot of people put forward. But negative gearing as a concept applies to a whole bunch of asset classes. In fact, if we remove negative gearing from the housing or property market, we would be creating an exception in the property market that exists in other asset classes.
I get politically, and I suspect there might be some people in the coalition who would be willing to have some changes to negative gearing, but I get politically seems to have been ruled out. But the capital gains tax discount, it just seems to me that could still be on the table. Is that?
Well, we have a budget process, 4 weeks, we'll all know what's in it there. I guess what I would say is that this is a really important public policy debate, and it's one that shouldn't be, I think, degenerate into politics as it has in some quarters.
What about the
certainly not here, but in other quarters it has.
I understand that. What about though the degeneration is a word that maybe some would use about what happened last week when we had a number of people on the coalition side, ministers, members of the ERC, backbenchers, all throwing their 2 cents in publicly on whether or not superannuation should be able to be accessed for a first home buyer deposit. Yeah, was that a tidy political debate?
Well, you know the old saying: if you like politics and laws, and sausages for that matter, you don't want to see either being made.
No,
I mean, public policy debate is not meant to be tidy. It's meant to actually get you the best outcome that you possibly can. And I think these discussions are important because for a whole generation of Australians, this owning your own home now seems unattainable. So anything that any level of government can do to make that more possible is something that we should be looking at. But ultimately, there are some economic fundamentals driving this. Undersupply is a big one. The planning laws are another, as you know. And the third one is spending on public transport infrastructure generally, because there's a whole bunch of economists have made the point that the better your transport infrastructure, the more land you have available for people to actually live in and on.
So let me ask you that then. I mean, the part of Sydney you represent,
Yep.
you know, it's got a growing population as well.
Yeah.
You know, new transport infrastructure being built. You know, is that the type of measure a federal government can get more involved with to help stimulate supply? Because the reality is the state budget doesn't stretch very easily to cover major new transport projects.
Yeah, so that's why in New South Wales we've had the asset recycling plan. So where you take old brownfield assets, you recycle that into greenfield assets. You've got West Connects, North Connects, Northwest Rail, Sydney CBD Light Rail, Parramatta Light Rail. All these things are having a massive impact. You've now got Beaches Link that was announced 3 weeks ago, which is a $14 billion road tunnel that starts in Manly Vale and finishes at West Connects. These things are going to make a massive difference to housing affordability in the next 10, 20 years.
And you'll be out there manning the barricades to increase density, I hope, along this new transport infrastructure?
Well, look, I've got to say that one of the things that does disappoint me about discussions around public or transport infrastructure is that people say, oh, well, this means higher density. And in some places it does, let's be honest. But for places like the Northern Beaches, just per se, and there are other places in Sydney, you know, they have 3 of the 10 most congested roads. The last major piece of road infrastructure or transport infrastructure built was in 1958. The population's increased 3.5 times.
A population.
And for large parts of Sydney, that's the case. And one of the arguments that is certainly going around amongst some economists is, well, maybe we should press the pause button on the number of immigrants we're letting into Australia because we need to be able to catch up just on the infrastructure front. It's not about building for new growth, it's about actually building for the growth that's happened.
All right, well, a lot of people would argue back that immigrants
Absolutely.
have a lot to do in terms of contributing small businesses and jobs. So
Sure.
it's a tough balancing act.
Yeah, I mean, my father came to this country as a migrant. You know, his contribution, I'd like to think, outweighed his costs. He certainly tells me
Well,
that.
they gave us a member of parliament.
Well, they did. Well, yeah, don't hold that against him, but, you know, he did lots of other things too.
All right, Jason Falinski, we're out of time. Thanks so much for joining
Thank you,
me.
Christina. Thanks for having
All
me.
right. Okay, well, coming up after the break, sport with every golfer's favorite type of shot as a pro cards, a magic moment on the USPGA Tour.